Hi, I am Tree Blasingame. I am your friendly neighborhood art cryptid. I am a conceptual mixed media artist, illustrator, and writer, and my background is in classics and history and literature and art education. So, wild mix. And just to reiterate what Sam said, please feel free to ask questions as we go. This is a lot of information, and I have a concern that there will be some decontextualization of questions get left to the end. If you don't feel comfortable with, shouting out your question, put it in chat. Sam's gonna be my mediator for that one. Or if you just want to lurk and be cryptid, that's cool too. We like lurkers here. So the title of the talk is very glib and very casual. We're all just goblins here, a casual jaunt through contemporary Gothic art and dark surrealism. And there are content warnings to be had. There's disturbing imagery, dismemberment, cannibalism, torture, nudity. Basically, if you can think of it, there might be a trigger warning for it. So keep yourself safe. Okay, disclaimer on like the subject matter itself. This is a very specific there's a very specific materiality to this presentation. It's circumscribed. It's very Western centric, very American centric, though to be fair, I do have a lot of Japanese and Korean artists in there, but a lot of them have come in through immigration. But it can be, this kind of analysis can be used to approach other artists who have been infected by the literary Gothic. Additionally, the artist I'm talking about here might not consider themselves either Gothic or dark surrealist, because we all have our different ways of identifying ourselves. An artist here is someone who creates and self identifies as an artist and creates work for both a public viewership that's both a part of public discourse and open for public criticism. So we're talking about people who put themselves out there in the world. Also, there are a lot of possible other art and artists I could look at here. These are just some of my favorites, and they're not even all of my favorites. So just take it with a grain of salt, enjoy, relax, and a friendly reminder that this is not a teleology. See there. So, a thought on contemporary Gothic art and dark surrealism is that it's like any art movement. It's a reaction and a response and a repurposing of the movements and arts that preceded them and exist in a conversation with each other. This is very much a conglomeration of cultural moments, just kind of having a serendipitous place to land. So Gothic art and dark surrealism may include things like abstracted doubling of space shape and haunting figures like we'll see in Alberto Giacometti. And please bear with me on how to say some of these names. They're hard for me. The praxis of sexuality and horror and experience, as happens in Francis Bacon's works. The dark subject matter and dread of existence through beauty like Aya Cato and Brooke Weston. Frisson between the kawaii, which means cute, and kawaii, which means scary, of Camilla de Erico, and cultural critique like Yao Kasama and Amano and Takashi Murakami. So a thing to remember is that art is foundational to the Gothic and is enmeshed with the language of the Gothic, from the obvious portrait of Dorian Gray to the various descriptions of landscapes and the picturesque and the pastoral, which pastoral goes all the way back to the fourth Pompeian style. So when we are boiling down to it, um, we're in an oversimplified manner. We have the terror Gothic and the horror Gothic for Sam. But I wanted to show like ways that it might be make more sense in a visual manner, with the terror Gothic having this like obscurity and supernatural and sublimity to it. So we have this piece by Aikato that overwhelms and overtakes and is somehow monstrous at the same time. And then we have this piece by Mark Husser, which is very much the horror Gothic with its fleshy ghosts.
Trie, can I ask a question?
Sure.
You mentioned like the pastoral and the fourth Pompeian, was it? I wonder if
Yes.
you could just give us what you were meaning there.
Oh, okay. In frescoes in ancient Rome, they had different styles. They had the first, second, and fourth Pompeian style, third, fourth Pompeian style, and the fourth Pompeian style had these very like circumspect depictions of like columns and grass and sheep, and very much things that you think of as the pastoral, and they were called pastorals. So that's basically what it is. It was a weird drive-by in my thought process. So some Gothic specifics: pastoral, picturesque, haunting, semiotics, the subject matter, body horror, monstrous, uncanny, doubling, doppelganger, return of the repressed anxiety, repetition, fantastic, the fantastic, exquisite corpse, and unconscious. And this is just like some general things. And this image is doing a lot of heavy lifting for me here because it's doing so many of these at once. Oh yes, Carol likes and Kara's gonna hate me how I say this. Louise Borges. My French is bad. I apologize. But this is Mamamba is 30 feet tall, 35 feet across. Lives with the Tate, but there are bronze versions that are at other places. But it's sorry, I got distracted by Caro again. But it's Louise Borges not only deals with like matters of body horror, but her own trauma, and the spider becomes a representation of her mother, which when you get into like where the trauma is coming from in her mother, it gets real interesting. But yes, it's uncanny. Even the photograph, the way it's photographed, even gives us the doubling, and it's such a good photo. Okay, I apologize. I will just like gush about things because they're cool. So we're gonna do a little art history because you need to do a little art history here. And we're gonna kind of breeze through the historical Gothic, Romanticism, Symbolism, Surrealism, second generation abstract expressionism, conceptual art, outside art, feminism, feminist art, pop art, super flat, and lowbrow / pop surrealism. Again, not a teleology. They just like kind of interconnect with each other. And our Francis Bacon and Alberto Giacometti pieces here are technically surrealist, but it gets complicated. The reason why I brought them together is that Francis Bacon does this thing called the hypercube, which if you look behind the figure, you can see that it looks like a room almost, but it's not because of the way that the frame is distended. And Alberto Giacometti does very like some similar things with his frames of his floating pieces, and I just think that's a very interesting juxtaposition. All right, historical Gothic. Here's our King's College. So highlights mid 12th century to the end of the 16th century-ish, depending on where you are. Painting, sculptures, architecture, style attributed to the Gothic tribes by Italian Renaissance writers, because let's blame the Goths for everything. And was a derogatory term until the Gothic revival between the 18th and 19th centuries. We have an early Gothic, a high Gothic that includes Renaissance and decorated Gothic, and late Gothic, in which Renaissance becomes flamboyant and decorated becomes perpendicular. And part of the thing that's interesting here is because we have this conception of the historical Gothic as being something dark and lacking in color, which isn't true. The historical Gothic is filled with light and color, but our reception has been tinged by centuries of soot and smoke, changing the appearance of these works, which means that what we think of as Gothic is a misconception and imposition of desire rather than reality.
What is the Ryan Nant one? What does that mean?
Oh God, I don't remember.
Sorry.
Sorry. Um, I really do not remember what it is off the top of my head, Sam. I am so sorry.
No worries. I don't know either.
I will look it up, remind myself between the two, and bring it for the afternoon. That's the other thing. It's like there is so much art history. I'm not going to be completely fluent in every single thing. So I am going to learn stuff too. Romanticism and symbolism. Um, Romanticism was like the end of the 18th century and was a reaction to modernity, like the Industrial Revolution, Enlightenment, and scientific rationalization. The emphasis was on emotion as a site of aesthetic experience, giving new credence to horror and terror and sublimity because of nature and mythology and nature and the supernatural. And it really preferred like the medieval to the classical and was part of like that Gothic revival. And we have Goya just going so hard. Goya is, oh boy howdy. And Eric was telling me before uh, all of this that evidently H.P. Lovecraft, that dastardly person, like name checks Goya everywhere. So there you go. It made it even into that. um, but we also have a little water house and a little Fuseli. Fuseli. There we go. I keep trying not to say a Fusili. With symbol.
Tree.
Yes.
I just had, and maybe this is anticipating, but the idea of sort of the tortured genius artist, of course, white guy mostly, and the idea of art for art's sake comes from romanticism. Is that something that does that eventually like come up when we get to surrealism and such? Is a parody of this idea, or is that just reaching a little?
A parody of art for art's sake, or
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's a parody, but it's definitely. Oh, somebody looked up Rayonet for you, Sam. I don't know if surrealism, like things like surrealism, would be considered a direct, like a parody, but there is a response to that disassociation from the modern. Because surrealism really, in its okay, and we're anticipating surrealism here a little bit in this answer, but surrealism, because of its origins in the trauma of like World War I and World War II, there isn't this way for it to disengage from the horror of reality, so it does other things with it. If that makes sense?
It does. Cool. Thank you.
We're having a conversation about rose windows in the chat, which is cool. Okay, so symbolism. It lasted about 1850s to as late as 1979, and it's one of those things that gets real complicated again. We're reaching that point where things like overlap and bleed against each other, but it's more usually considered to have lasted to the 20s or 40s. It used mythological and dream imagery. The symbols are usually intensely personal, private, obscure, and ambiguous references, which I'm not sure how either of these are ambiguous, but that's me. I'm a classicist. It's really more of a philosophy than a style of art, and gets mixed up with the decadents, who were visually very similar but philosophically different, like the opposite. Evidently, I did this yesterday too. Eric, remind me the name. Uh, who wrote Portrait of Dorian Gray? That person whose brain is not.
Oscar Wilde.
I don't know why I have a block on Oscar Wilde this week, but I have a block on Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde evidently is actually part of this like subgroup of the decadents, which I did not know. So I learned a thing in doing this. But the Simplest Manifesto is very much this art movement thus in this art movement, representations of nature, human activities, and all real life events don't stand on their own. They are rather veiled reflections of the senses, pointing to archetypal meanings through their esoteric connections. The too long didn't read is to depict not the thing but the effect it produces. And we have here the Kiss of the Sphinx by Franz von Stuck, which is quite literally one of my favorite historical paintings, because we have the presentation of the riddle of the Sphinx being not only something that is sexual but devouring, and it gets real interesting with the story of Oedipus, and it's just bloody and raw, and it's so good. And we have some oops and we have some Klimt in there, because you always have to have a little Klimt somewhere. Historical surrealism. It's 1920s to 1950s, but this is incredibly complicated because Louise Borges gets lumped into the surrealists. There are several generations of surrealists. It's wild. It developed as after World War I as an outgrowth of Dadaism, which the difference between Dadaism and Surrealism is really a matter of exteriorized cultural critique and interiorized personal critique. It's revolutionary. It's a revolutionary philosophical movement. Dreams in the unconscious and the return of the repressed, with the purpose of unleashing the unconscious to, quote, resolve the previously contradictory conditions of dream and reality into an absolute reality, a super reality. And so much of it is trauma. There's so much trauma going on in the surrealist movement, like Zdzisław Beksiński, Polish, hard to say, because he's not of that first generation of surrealists, but he did experience World War II and the Holocaust, and all of his art became an extension of dealing with that trauma. He makes beautiful landscapes that are just kind of blood dripping at the same time, and hands that are built out of grenades, and it's an entire thing. And then we have somebody like Alberto Giacometti, who in Carolyn in particular is having this deep like Egyptian revival moment, because there was like a micro Egyptian revival in the 60s, with this presentation of his lover Carolyn as Nefertiti. And you can't tell, it's always hard to tell in prints of this or pictures, but if you see it in person, there is like a little scribble of a figure that in the background that haunts her even. And it's a very large painting. It's like 6 feet. It is a big piece. Something else that to know about surrealism is that what we think of as surrealism is really André Breton war of attritioning the other surrealists. He basically came in and browbeat everybody under his definitions. So, hence why surrealism is really complicated. I mean, they like excommunicated people from the movement.
Oh, Tree.
Tree, I got a question.
Two of us.
Dario, you beat me. Go ahead.
Oh, cool. I was just going to ask when that painting, The Bone Horse, was from, if you know roughly.
Which painting? I'm sorry.
The Bone Horse.
Oh, I forgot to put the.
Yeah, I'm just interested when it was connected to.
I forgot to put the year, and I do not remember off the top of my head. I want to say it was like 70s, maybe. I'm not sure though.
No, cool. I'll go. I'm inspired. I'll go look him up. Thank you.
He is like the surrealist artist that everybody knows that they don't realize they know. He's kind of been an internet phenomenon, and there's an entire thing about he's cursed. His paintings are cursed because somebody murdered him. A friend of his murdered him. It's wild. And he it was relatively recently. He died in like 2010 or something like that.
Oh, I'm definitely going to look him up. Thank you.
Yeah. I had a question, Tree.
Yes.
So I'm curious, as these more gruesome themes that were sort of from artists that were kind of working through World War I and then World War II, what was kind of the conversation between these artists and other artists and art critics? I know like there was a whole thing with people either loved or hated Giacometti because they either got it or they didn't.
Mm. Was there more to that question?
No, I don't know if I asked it very well. just how were people like freaked out by this stuff, or did they understand it in general, do you think?
My impression has always been that there is an understanding of it. I mean, like Breton and his group, like Dali and Magritte and Matisse, are less gruesome, clearly. Though it still has that, especially Dali seems likes to dismember bodies in his pieces and turns them into other things. But yeah, there generally does, in my impression, is that people knew what was going on. This is one of those fun things about the early 20th century art movements. They created manifestos. They wrote things and published them in the paper saying, this is what we're doing, this is why we're thinking it. So it was a lot less obscure than how artists do things now. Does that help?
Yeah, I think so.
Do you have a follow-up?
Just that, well, what do you think that was? I mean, like, because they were like, well, goes, yeah, like you said, we don't do that now. Why is that? What's different?
Well, part of what's different is that we don't generally have like these really cohesive movements anymore.
Okay.
I mean, it's like when I talk about pop surrealism, yeah, it's a movement. We can tell where it began, but it also spans multiple countries that are not necessary, and the artists within those countries aren't necessarily communicating and going about it in different ways. It's just really, it's like it's a fractal now.
Okay.
Though to be clear, metamodernism, which is something I'm going to talk about later, does have a manifesto.
Okay.
And I also think part of it is we don't have clear like people leading movements anymore either. We've become very anarchical. Anarchic. And it's much easier when you have this center of the art world being like in Paris or London or New York or Chicago versus everywhere.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Okay, making sure I answered it as well as I could.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
It's the early and mid 20th century is just wild. It's
Mhm.
so much fun. Um, okay, art history, abstract expressionism, the second generation. Abstract expressionism started in like the 40s and is the inheritor of expressionism, and it's largely anti-figural and apolitical in the first generation, which is especially fun because the CIA started like funding it and using it as propaganda. Um, Basically, the first generation of abstract expressionists kind of retired from the world instead of like the surrealists and the neo-dadists and stuff and confronting the world. They retired from it. They went into hermitage, more or less. um the second generation of abstract expressionists is incredibly political, and this is one of those places where the idea of cultural semiotics, cultures within cultural semiotics, and personal semiotics really just like sit and have a good time. Um, and it's like here we have Jasper Johns, who's really the most well known for his American flag paintings. The one that's here was one that was commissioned for him as a protest against the Vietnam War. And we also have Rauschenberg doing what he referred to as combines, where he took and and his combines are really very much kind of like a predecessor of like what pop surrealism and lowbrow art and things are going to be doing. And Marcel Duchamp did the same thing with his ready-mades. We're taking cultural, like recognizable things that have a meaning and putting them into your art. In this case, a taxidermied goat with a tire around it, situated into and onto one of his paintings, and bed, which is literally bed sheets that he painted and screen printed on. And and it makes the best story. The story is that they are his sheets. They are his actual sheets that he used. Which means that bed is literally a signature. It is the most body that he could make into his art. And the abstract expressionists, second generation and first generation, love putting their bodies into art in weird ways. Uh, Conceptual art, which is late 60s, early 70s, but it persists in contemporary art making. Please remember, I called myself a conceptual mixed media artist. The art is driven by concept, often rooted in theory. And I'm giving an honorable mention to the art and language group because they literally created hypertextual art pre-internet, which is amazing. But the piece usually when people talk about conceptual art, they think of something like One in Three Chairs by Joseph Kosuth, which he made none of these. He did not make the chair. He did not take the picture. He did not write the definition. Yet, in bringing them together and contextualizing them into the gallery space, he gives us a semiotics of what chair is, and also criticizes the idea that there is one true idea of an object. And this idea of, the semiotics of the chair uh, persists even into like Occupy Wall Street, where this artist took replicas of the signs people were protesting with and turned them into chairs so that you could literally protest with your sign as a chair. And then he totally like gouged rich people for the money and donated it. So it's one of my favorite just like weird things that conceptual artists managed to do. Outsider art. Outsider art, it is like literally what it sounds like. It's basically artists who have who are outside of the fine art world and or have little to no formal art training. It includes art brut, art of the mentally ill, folk art, visionary art, vernacular art, visionary environments. Basically, all artists at some point in time are outsider artists, which is not a thing we talk about, but it's true. We all start there. um, but it's also outsider art is, I find it very derogatory because it usually the people who are included into it are people who are grossly disenfranchised and decentered from overarching culture. Women, people of color. But the piece here is Dr. Evermore's Forever Tron, which is a vernacular art piece, a visionary environment that's actually here in Wisconsin. And it's curated by the Kohler, which it's like most people know Kohler because sinks, faucets, they have a museum. It's weird, I know. Feminist art gets really wild. It's associated with the 60s and 70s and second wave feminism, but it persists. It's often, sorry, I got distracted by the chat. It's often centered on the body as both object and abject. And I wanted to show the video of this, but it's like the one I wanted to show was a minute and a half long, and I felt like it was too much. And the rest of them were like 3 and 5 minutes. But Rhythm Zero by Marina Brongovich is one of the quintessential artist as object and abject performance pieces. She literally put herself into a gallery, presented people with a variety of props, and people could do whatever they wanted to her. And there was guns, there was knives, there were roses, people undressed her. The story goes that literally people had to cause the performance to end because she was remaining as abject. So it is a deeply traumatizing video to watch. Linda Banglis is another one of the quintessential feminist artists, though this is a more recent piece of hers. She has this tendency to make abstract pieces that are somehow very bodily, very fleshy. And we, as always, the Guerrilla Girls. You always need to include the Guerrilla Girls in a thing.
Quick question,
yes.
Tree. Yeah, just harking back to the surrealists, because I've been just sort of thinking of women, and then it's great. Yeah, were there any prominent women surrealists during
Yes,
the
there
surrealist?
were.
Yeah.
I
mean, I know there were. That's an obvious question, but yeah, just interested in who's prominent for you. Yeah. So.
I am terrible at names. Let me tell you that. But if you look up fur-covered teacup or fur teacup, there you go. I mean, technically, she came out of the Bauhaus, but she was a very early surrealist. I'm just really miserable at names. I'm sorry, Daru.
That's okay. It's cool. Thank you.
That's literally like why all these things have like names under them, so I remember who they are. Also, so it's easier for you to find things. So pop art's a movement that weirdly developed in the US and the UK like basically at the same time because of sharing of culture in the mid to late 50s with very different motivations. It's like American pop art was really really anti-capitalistic and critical and commentating and bringing popular culture into art, like comic book panels and the Batman vroom pow pop sort of thing that we have with Roy Lichtenstein here. Whereas in the UK, it was much more like commenting on what the Americans were doing. Like, look at that weirdness over there, which is fair. It challenged fine art by the utilization of pop culture artifacts and ephemera, and it was deeply postmodern. And we have kind of an interesting span from Roy Lichtenstein in '63 doing the comic book pops to Yayoi Kusama, who is Japanese, and one of the things she's most well known for is creating these mirrored rooms that go on forever. And often they're filled with polka dots and mushrooms. But I just really like this one because it's so full of light. It feels like the lantern festivals where you send lanterns into the sky. If you've seen Rapunzel, like that, it feels very much like that for me. And Yayoi Kasama has deep mental health issues, so it's really interesting to see her work and what her mind thinks is important. To be fair, a lot of artists have deep mental issues. Super Flat. Now, Super Flat's a weird one, and it's kind of like an obscure one unless you're a pop surrealist kind of artist person. It's It's a Japanese contemporary art movement that emerged in the 2000s, and Japanese art has this very flat tendency, and especially in the two-dimensional art that comes out of the Edo era's ukiyo-e art, which was woodblock prints, and it's more often referred to as the floating world. It's like if you think about Japanese art, you're probably thinking about Edo era. And Super Flat rides that line between the kawaii, which is cute, and the kawaii, which is scary. It criticizes capitalism and commercialism, as well as otaku culture, which otaku culture is geek culture, but think really the most toxic version of it. And then you have otaku culture, especially when you're talking about otakus in America, because we have to take it like 40 steps further. It criticizes Japanese colonialist history and Japan's usage of kawaii culture to gloss over it. Because in case you didn't know, Japan was once a colonial power. And it's obviously blurring of the line in contemporary art between high art and low art. And these are things that are very scare quoted. But with Japanese culture being like very formal, very regimented, you have Super Flat, which kind of like blows it all up a little bit. And here we have Takashi Murakami, who is basically the founder of Super Flat, more or less. He's the one who's attributed to being the founder. And he's here looking like a cult leader. So craft is also one of those things that plays a big part in art making, obviously, in a lot of ways. But crafting and the crafting of art, with the rise of like art as an academic endeavor, made it like a less than position. Really, because it's women's work, which is but because of that and the rise of the art as an academic endeavor, which was largely masculine, we lose a lot of like techniques and semiotics, and the arts and craft movement and high craft really brought those things back into contemporary art making. It also re-enfranchised previously outsider artists, because again, outsider artists are always marginalized. They're always women, always decentralized in some way. And it really connected specifically to third wave feminism and activism with things like yarn bombing and guerrilla knitting. This kind of craft is inherently anti-capitalist and very environmentally minded. And one of my favorite examples of it is Oleg's crocheted suit for the Charging Bull on Wall Street. Because it literally lasted, she did put it up in the middle of the night. It lasted about 2 hours once like the people who like managed down there showed up. And then it was cut off. So this is literally a guerrilla installation. Okay, we're coming to the end of the art history stuff. Thank you for staying with me this far. Lowbrow art and pop surrealism, they really evolved initially in the 60s in LA. It's very populist. It includes graffiti art and, oh my God, so cute. Yes, Allie. It includes graffiti art and underground comics and scenes and punk music and culture and just so many things. It's sarcastic, it's brightly colored, it's deeply critical. And it's a movement that is multivalent because it includes a myriad of subgenres and approaches and can have vastly different tenets. There's that fractal thing I was talking about. So a working definition of Gothic art and dark surrealism out of all of this is contemporary Gothic art and both the first and second generation of dark surrealism are like this locus of intense theoretical application. Yeah, I love Mark Ryden's work too. As well as crossbreeding several generations worth of formal art movements and informal art making, and it's inter and intra-cultural cross-pollination. And then you throw in the internet and it just gets wild. In a very real way, contemporary Gothic art and dark surrealism are parts of a logical outcropping of metamodernism, where the products of deconstruction and criticism are retasked and reformed into a newly synthesized reality that is laced with hope and activism.
So yeah, just quickie question. When you say modernism, what would you mean by that?
It's coming.
Okay, cool. Thank you, sir.
This is kind of like a weird thing. That because one of the first places that we see the term modern Gothic is in 2004 in the Village Voice. And ooh, come back here. Sorry, it got away from me. Come back. Okay. That almost all, and he described the modern Gothic as almost all art that could be called Gothic has an ironic edge. It's aware of its position, even the absurdity of position, yet it persists with sincere tongue and ironical cheek. Artists are using images and symbols in ways that attempt to short circuit the sense that things are controlled from without. They're trying to make them more expression controlled in art and instigating smaller systems of meaning making. Now here's where we get into the thing. Although it's always more proletarian, we're still talking about suburbia. We're talking about Dungeons and Dragons, Doom, Anne Rice, though why he spelled Anne wrong, I don't know. Teenage angst, masculine overdrive, and The Cure. Not Poe and Hawthorne, which I do not necessarily agree with him. Modern Gothic is many things, some of them promising. Lest we forget, however, most art that is primarily Gothic is and always has been schlock. It's campy and corny, nostalgic and shallow. Indeed, any art that is essentially one thing is in danger of becoming monotonous. Forms stagnant, cheap thrills and cliches predominate. Potent symbols and mock horror are really embraced. The best modern Gothic art is way more than Gothic, and that's what makes it worth looking at and thinking about right now. Now, the thing with that, that it, that while Saltz is somewhat accurate when he's talking about the trend of Gothic art in the early aughts, this resurgence of the interest in the Gothic as art and music and culture and expression didn't go away, and in fact found a new place in which to flourish and propagate in lowbrow art, and the way that lowbrow art was becoming the emerging pop surrealist movement. Instead of being schlocky and corny and campy and shallow, dark surrealism, as a subgenre of pop surrealism, became whimsical and tortured, critical and hopeful. Okay. Got ahead of myself. So when we refer to the contemporary Gothic, it conjures an image of ruined castles and cemeteries filled with fog, elegant monsters thirsting for blood, and not so elegant monsters shambling through the scenery, haunted houses and dangerous forests. Quote, the haunting aesthetic that began in earnest with the pre-Raphaelites and their love of the romantic and magic, and perfected by John William Waterhouse and Edward Burne-Jones, an aesthetic that has enjoyed a stunning cultural renaissance. Yet contemporary Gothic art is also constructed from different facets of the modern Gothic genre, from artwork with distant roots in medieval and Renaissance classicism to places influenced by post-punk revival and the contemporary Gothic Renaissance sensibilities of the internet age. So we have a lot going into this. And then when we refer to dark surrealism, we're likely stuck in the historical surrealist moment, melting clocks and strange bodies moving through stranger landscapes, twee fairy collages and nostalgic shadow boxes filled with children's toys. Or if we're really lucky, we get dystopian dreamscapes like Zdzislaw Bezinski and his tortured figures in overgrown melted ruins. Dark surrealism and Gothic art are both most often relegated to lowbrow art, often to mere illustration, to the point that the creators of and within pop surrealism, which dark surrealism is part of, cheerfully refer to its roots as being lowbrow, despite the both contemporary Gothic art and dark surrealism's origins can be traced through romanticism, symbolism, surrealism, second generation abstract expressionism, conceptual art, outsider art, feminist art, and superflat. Too long, didn't read. There is no one true style when it comes to contemporary Gothic art or dark surrealism. Like the historical Gothic and historical surrealism, there are many ways in which to approach their thematic concerns. That was a lot of words. So the theoretical shenanigans. We have the aesthetic, which primarily we're going to look at the abject, object, subject, and sublimity. We have deconstruction, well, semiotics with deconstruction and simulation, simulacra underneath it. Autobiographical theory with alterity and metamodernity. So for aesthetic theory, we're focusing on art, but it's an interdisciplinary, looking to politics, sociology, and philosophy, metaphysics. It's inherently reliant on sublimity and the sublime, and the advent of postmodernism and metamodernism has been moved to include the body and embodied aesthetics, the everyday and the abject. Semiotics, which is the signed and the signified, it's the deconstruction of the sign, the pulling apart, and the signified emphasizes the changing meaning of all types of language, including visual ones, and discusses the metatextual information that's brought up by the understanding of a sign. So when you're looking at Costa's chair, there is so much more connected than a chair. There's the type of chair it is. There's your personal associations with that chair, that kind of chair. Like in Wisconsin, they're very weirdly common for some reason. I don't know why, but they're very the old school folding chair. So yeah, that went sideways. Sorry. Simulation and simulacra contends with the nature of what is real and not real, what is a sign without an actual signifier, how we arrived at a place of pure simulacra from a place of sign, which is a very condensed version of Baudrillard right there. And metamodernism for Daru, which was initially called postmodernism, but yike, what a name. It takes the meditations and preoccupations of the postmodern and it further deconstructs them, criticizes and comments upon them, and then takes all of that and synthesizes it into something new and does something with it, which is something that postmodernism kind of, it stops at the deconstruction and the criticism and doesn't often move further than that. For some reason, I did not put alterity and autobiographical theory into here. But autobiographical theory is exactly what it says in the tin. It's the theories by which we use to describe ourselves and explain who we are. And alterity is at its most simple how we define ourselves because we're not like those other people. One of the most important things about autobiographical theory that's going to come up in like the next slide is the idea that there is no interior individual self. There is only the self that you can define by what's outside of you. Because everything we use to explain ourselves once we go outside of ourselves, actually inside of ourselves, is language we've learned that's been created, objects, signs, stories, everything comes from outside of us. Okay, so we're getting into like finally like looking at just art and just talking about it. So thank you for bearing with me. So these are artists that they're being loosely discussed by the themes of identity and body and memory. Many of these artists are easily situated in several places at the same time, especially in regards to modern takes on Gothic art and Dark Surrealism. Who one is and who one has been is unified through a bodily experience and often a bodily aesthetic. And due to the variety of artists that exist, this is not remotely comprehensive. It's a cross section. That's not even a big cross, it's a little cross section. So with identity, what we're looking at is the struggle with whether an individual interior self actually exists. Art making is inherently semiotic, so an artist's self-identification is subject to historically and culturally developed signs and curated by individual context. It's who am I as an individual, who am I in relationship to others and the cultures I belong to, what imposed identities do I accept or reject? The body becomes a site upon which identity is literally written and imposed. It's the mode by which art is created. It is a place in which art can be constructed. It's a source of information through lived experience. It's the abject, the subject, and the object in turns. And we have to ask ourselves, is the body a biological organism or a cultural artifact? With memory, we have to remember that it's selective and malleable. It's a companion to history, both a personal history and a cultural history, and therefore is, again, an inherent part of art making. It's connected to the body as events experienced through the body, can be public and personal, and is a synthesis of past and present and a future extrapolation. Okay. So our first artist we're going to talk about is Alexander McQueen. And this is really a place if y'all wouldn't like pipe up and talk, feel free. Alexander McQueen was a fashion designer. His stuff's real good. I agree, Allie. He's dead. He killed himself. He succumbed to depression. Yes, costumes for ballets, fashion design, but my favorite pieces of his are his very conceptual wearable art pieces like these. And this is just a few of them. But these are from later pieces he made that where he was really really preoccupied with the idea of heaven and hell. Sam's having a problem with the sun over there. Having thoughts about heaven and hell because of his battle with depression. But you also get this feeling of like drag culture. He was queer. But you also get like the overgrowing of the body and the overtaking of it. Amano, who's seen Vampire Hunter D? Yes, you know Amano. Or if you've read Sandman, he did the illustrations for the Dream Keepers, something like that. But Amano, even in Japan, he has a very singular style, and his style often often has these fluctuations of light and dark, especially when he's doing what he called paper operas, which are the skull, the tree, and our two figures up at the top. They are the Flying Dutchman, Siegfried, and I want to say Tristan and Isolde. Yes, the tree is one of my favorites. I'm pretty sure it's from Siegfried, Wagner.
It feels kind of quite like Yggdrasil like.
Yeah, it's very much Yggdrasil. But yeah, it's like you can see the Gothic elements of like the dark and the oppressive and the pastoral with the tree. I feel like the way he uses light and dark really do like Gothic-y things too. Gives that simulation of like light and ruins. Okay, now Nick Cave. Nick Cave is wild. He teaches at the Art Institute of Chicago's School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He makes these things called sound suits, which it's a very brief video, so please enjoy. So I know this doesn't seem like it should. Yes, post-COVID mask alternative. Yes. May not seem like it's a Gothic-y piece, but things to remember about it. And this is one of those places where an artist's context is very important. He is a Black man. And he's trying to reconnect with his lost ancestral heritage. So these are very reminiscent of some of like the headdresses and stuff from different places in Africa. He also, not in these specific pieces, but in other pieces, builds them explicitly out of things he gets at flea markets. So not only is there the meaning that he's bringing to them, there's an inherent meaning in the objects themselves. So there's multiple histories going on at once, multiple histories and some signs inscribed upon a piece at any time. And there's also the deformation of the body, and that same kind of thing you get with clowns, where it's like you don't know what's under there. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. I'm watching you, Sam, to see how much things make sense. We have Ray Cesar, who is a contemporary pop surrealist, but I would call him a dark surrealist. I mean, like, look at this kind of like Rococo nonsense, and we got like some Russian stuff going on here just for Sam. He also has a tendency to like tentacles. I could do this entire talk just with things with tentacles. But Ray Cesar is a very interesting artist. He has dissociative identity disorder. So when you read his bios of himself, they're a ride, because you're getting at least 3 different identities at any time with it. And this kind of high femme figure that shows up in his work is one of his alters, and her name is Harry. But his work has this like cosmic horror sense to it, merged with like this uncomfortableness of seeing something childlike, not doing childlike things. A lot of his work is like, I don't want to say sexual, sensual, like confronting you with the idea of the body as something that experiences the world, which for someone who has disassociated identity disorder, that is a very complicated relationship. But I do just like how, like, just how ornate his work is too, which is something else with, Gothic stuff. It has this very specific kind of ornateness. Yeah, there are like entire stories behind his stuff. Sarah Moon, who is one of my favorite photographers. She does, I mean, she started off as a fashion model, weirdly enough. And she moved into making these like storybook photographs, which the one on the left, my left, should be your left, with the little girl, is Morgan Le Fay. But instead of like, how like sometimes Merlin is portrayed as aging backwards, she's given it to Morgan. And that the forest comes with her even into the city. So you have this like infiltration and infection of the natural into the urban and stuff and things like that. And the one on the left, she did an entire series where she took a doll that she found in a junk shop and restuffed it, and just took these uncanny photographs of this doll. And there's something really lovely about her process, that kind of the kind of fuzziness of it, the way it blurs, that gives us this feeling of like almost forgotten memory. Again, I can do this entire thing with tentacles. Chiara Battista, whose handle is actually Milk. It's like when I think of pop surrealism and dark surrealism, I really think of her, because she has all these chimeric beings who are, you know, violent in some way a lot of times. We have Marmot on the left who's eating a bird. And we have the central figure who's a hind hunting people. And it's just like, these are things where like nature becomes the repressed and comes to take its vengeance on you. And plus, like, the deer girl has like little like birds on her head. They're little skeleton birds, which, yes, I am having a it's so twee I'm going to die moment, but it's so twee I'm going to die. And she has an amazing amazing body of work. Camille de Erica, which, Sam, I have brought you a hedge just for you. Camille de Erica is who, like, along with like Mark Ryden, most people think of when they think of pop surrealism. And yes, she is very poppy, and Rainbow Hedge is very poppy, but she also creates these figures that are pulled apart, who are being turned into honeycombs, who have holes within them, and they're melting rainbows, bleeding rainbows. But then she also does things like the far right, which is a piece inspired by Donnie Darko. It's Frank the Bunny, which, if you have never seen Donnie Darko, Frank the Bunny is deeply disturbing. I'm glad I could help you see it. The last artist, Chiara Bautista. And she also, I mean, she of course she does Sailor Moon. I think all of us do Sailor Moon at some point. But she also has done like some beautiful He-Man work. She has an entire series that are called Zombies that are inspired by The Walking Dead. So her work is really fun, but it still has all those little gothic elements. I love a candy-colored monstrosity and rainbow horror. Again, for Sam. This is Anya Boz, who, if you have not seen the Hans White Persian cat gif, the internet has failed you as a person. But not only does she make these very uncanny cats, she also makes these like almost forest gods who lack faces. And it looks like it should just be black fur. No, there's a hole there. They're posable. It has a neck, and you can stick your hands down in it. So it is an absence. It is so uncanny, so uncomfortable, and so good. Brian Froud, because I promised Brian Froud. I totally forgot I promised Brian Froud and had to like sneak him in. But Brian Froud's work for me, I mean, it's definitely has that ruined castle feel, that oppressive, not all of his stuff, but some of it, that dark oppressiveness, but it's also, it's memory, it's fairy stories from when we were kids, but in like ways that our fairy stories didn't come to us, if that makes sense. Like they're like the nightmares that are hiding underneath our fairy stories. But this illustration of the Skeksis Tower from Dark Crystal has big Vlad the Impaler vibes. Yeah, I agree. There can be a real sense of sadness in his work. His beings run the gambit from from sad to maniacal to mischievous to pure. In the book of Good and Bad Fairies, there is a good fairy called the Fairy of Pure Joy, and she's just like this perfect angelic radiant being, which is deeply uncomfortable for some reason. Scott Trelevon, who he is a contemporary artist. He would neither consider himself a contemporary Gothic art or dark surrealist artist, but he comes out of the same kind of places that those originate. Comes out of punk culture and zines. He does a lot of different work. This is some of my favorite kind of work he makes. These are large scale painted collages with like the black and white is like photography that he's like printed and collaged on. They are very large. They are more than people sized. He also has a fascination with the supernatural and the occult, though he is an atheist. He is queer. I feel like that's like should be clear that he is queer, but he is. He did an entire zine with an accompanying documentary called Salivation Nation that is it's like Fight Club goes pure on art and even more liminal and not sure what's going on. Melissa Susan Stanley, who is also known as Wool Beasts. That's another thing. A lot of contemporary Gothic artists and dark surrealist artists have monikers. We name ourselves or we name our studios, and therefore our names aren't necessarily connected with what we make. So these are some of my favorite things that Melissa Sue Stanley makes. She has a preoccupation with as I just lost the name, the chicken shacks. Russian fairy tales.
Baba Yaga?
Say that again, I'm sorry.
Baba Yaga?
Thank you, Baba Yaga. See, brain, not there. She has this preoccupation with Baba Yaga's chicken shack. I mean, she does make Baba Yaga occasionally, but the chicken shacks keep reappearing. And they're always kind of sweet and kind of awkward and completely kind of upsetting because they're sad and awkward. She also makes these things like the central image, which literally burst out of frames like they're coming through a portal from another dimension. And then things like our friend on the far right, who is like one of the things emerging from the portal, who's been running around for a while. The House of Chicken Legs. Yeah, I always called it a chicken shack. I think she refers to it as a chicken shack, and that's why that happens in my head. Yeah, the monstrous and the cute together, and it's that you can see with pop surrealism having that influence from like super flat, that the cute and the scary can exist in one place because it's one step to the left. Brandy Milne, who it's like everybody's like experience of Merry Melodies when they're a kid, but if it was bloody or more bloody, I guess. She works in a variety of media. These, I want to say, are oil paints. She does acrylics and oil, but she also does like stuff in like charcoal and pastel too. But I'm pretty sure these are from her oils. But she loves to bring that candy colored horror. Cherries and strawberries that swiftly like bleed into blood, skeletons who are just kind of like existing snowmen who are covered in gore. So many of the things that you think of really like more in like the fleshy ghost part of the horror gothic lives in her stuff. And she is this tiny little blonde cute thing. I don't know why this is important to me, but she does not look like she makes this stuff. Lauren Marks, who she has this real preoccupation with with decomposition and rotting and the environments that grow out of them. So you're always going to get something dead. You're always going to get something flowery. You're always going to feel like it's fungal in some way. And she does this with watercolors and gouache. And it's like the stag and the doe. I love like the doubling of it, and while also feeling like they're the same being. It's very uh, William Williamson, the Poe story. I am bad with names. I apologize. But yeah, and it's like we have skulls being overgrown by mushrooms and flowers, and it's like beautiful decay. And Hillerbrandjandattir, which I probably just did not say that correctly. She's Icelandic, if you can't guess from that last name. She's a fiber artist, but she does very interesting, specific things with her work. Her work is very much modern, meta modern, where it deconstructs it and then reconstructs into something new. So she's using the fiber arts that she's learned from her mother, her aunt, her gran, to create things that, like the doily skull, which connects us not only to the idea of the decorative, but that the decorative dies, as and not only does the decorative die, but the person who created the decoration die. So they're a memento mori until they're not anymore. Um, Really, one of the favorite pieces she does, um, which is like the ultimate deconstruction, is she takes cotton thread or cotton string and pushes like and scrumbles it out into an amorphous pattern, and then pushes graphite powder into it. It's literally a drawing. It's just not a figural drawing, because what's a drawing? It's graphite on paper. Artists use primarily cotton paper. Jessica Jocelyn, who is our second entry into steampunk, is totally gothic. And she's a Chicago artist, but she uses these she uses like real animal skulls and connects them with like filigree brass and silver and other very like rococo elements to create these very unique animals that no longer belong to the natural world, but don't belong to our world either. They look like they're rotting, um, but they also look like they're kind of persisting because they're steam powered, like they don't have a choice in living. It's beautiful and just kind of disturbing, and the shapes that are created by the bodies are even more interesting, especially when she does stuff like like when she does creatures in sequence that are meant to be viewed together. They may not be sold together, but they're meant to be viewed together, and that's an entirely different conversation about how artists intend their work to be seen, how versus how it ends up being taken out into the world. But the shapes they lose, the shapes they build against each other, um, the knowledge that a lot of birds like pair bond, and yeah, it goes a lot. What is Kenneth saying about goblin? I saw something about goblin. Okay. Cool. Mandy Greer, who is fiber artist, she's moved away from these like wearable and installation pieces, but these are some of my favorite things that she does. And these are all hand crocheted. They're beaded. They're dyed. They are bodily intense pieces of art to make and to wear, which is one of those things about being an artist. Our bodies literally are the things by which we create art. But Slug Princess, which is the piece on the right, is a performance piece. It's meant to be worn. It's meant to be drugged through the forest like something out of A.S. Bayat. I mean, it trails like a slug, hence why it's a Slug Princess. It had the person she has it on is I want to say of Japanese descent, Chinese or Japanese descent. I do not remember. But the way that the crown of the piece falls down is really evocative of like headdresses from like China. The piece on the right is basically Actaeon from the myth of Artemis and Actaeon. And so we have this deer who's been ripped apart, and we have simulated blood, but it's all fiber. And it's like, because women's work, fiber art and women's work are so inherently connected, it gets really mixed up with the body and the blood of the body, and it does interesting things. Talking more about the body as art, body making art, Ines Reichlich. She's a photographer and a model, but she has a skin condition where her skin is hypersensitive, and it marks like this from casual wear, not from anything weird. Like, there are pieces where she's put a feather on her body and like barely pressed it in, and you'll have the marks of the feather left on her. They are creepy, but it's also really cool, because it echoes the idea of scarification in body mod circles, but it also are the telltale marks of like womanhood imposed upon the body. So it has a lot of that, how women have historically been shunted to the side and contained. And I think the particularly using like a corsetry one, even though like modern people kind of have an inherent misunderstanding of corsetry, is really interesting too. Aokato, who is one of my favorite Japanese super flat artists. The bulk of her work is connected to fairy tales. So we have that like othering, and that sorry, got tired. That othering that happens in fairy tales, the horror of it. The one on the far left is a take on Snow White. The one on the far left is a take on Snow White. The one on the far right is a take on Red Riding Hood, where Red Riding Hood is the wolf. So beauty and monstrosity sitting side by side. I feel like it's like Ayakato does a real interesting thing with like the sublime, where she centers it so far into the body that you don't realize you're being overwhelmed by it. Kiharu Kiharu Shiota, haha, can say it. Remember I talked about Marina Abramovich earlier and making herself into an abject object in the gallery space? She was Kiharu Shiota's teacher, which is part of the reason why, again, we have that deep red that connects to blood and womanhood and memory. Because feminist artists, if there's one thing about feminist artists, they love their blood. We love our blood. Whether it's simulated, whether it's actual, blood comes into play someplace. But for Shiota, those red strings are connections to other lives and other people and other places. So this is all one. All of these are giant memories. Memories of immigration and people she had to leave behind. Memories of being in school. Memories of children she knew. And Dohusu, who is a Korean artist. These works are made out of like silk and nylon, and they are intricately sewn. Again, we have this idea of women's work, and it being connected to the home and home and security. The Dohusu is a man, but his is very connected to an immigrant story. So we have these places literally haunting him, not only in his memory, but in the gallery space as fabric ghosts. So they're just so fascinating. They are so large. It's like the one in the top right. It's like you can see the gallery door for scale. That's how large that thing is. They are big enough to walk in. And let's have a summation. So for me, contemporary Gothic art and dark surrealism are inherently metamodern movements, since they erupt out of a variety of historical movements and overarching cultures and cultures within cultures, as well as being an intersection for a number of theories such as semiotics and simulation and simulacra. Except the contemporary Gothic art and dark surrealism take all these ingredients, constructs them, criticizes and comments upon them, and then takes them and turns them into something new. Instead of the simulation of late capitalism, where the simulation precedes the reality, we have a simulated reality that is rejected, and a new possibility for reality is presented through such endeavors as things like race bending and gender bending and participatory culture, in which the rejection of the accepted presented simulated reality with one that is a reflection of an actual reality. So we basically, through this kind of art making, like representation happens again. The reality of unlived experience of artists as people who are queer, who are immigrants, who are people of color, comes back into the sign and signifier. And the hyperreal of the internet has in some ways become a place of actual lived experience and an actual representation because of the increased accessibility of the internet. Like even 10 years ago, putting together this talk would have been difficult. And yeah, but it's like basically candy colored art is as likely to be Gothic and dark as what's more traditionally perceived as dark. So there you go. And if you are interested in pop surrealism, dark surrealism, high fructose, juxtaposed and hyperallergic, I'll do articles on it. And just because I feel like I should, works consulted.
Thank you. So there we go. There we go, peeps. I am being blinded by the sun. What is this madness?
You really are.
Really am, yeah. It's weird. Sorry, I look like I'm in some sort of, I don't know, prison going on here. Who knows? Yes,